welcome back to the Dialed In webcast. I'm Allan Gray. I'm the Executive Director of Dial Ventures at Purdue University, a startup studio focused on creating new ventures for the ag and food industry to help digitize that industry. Today, we're really fortunate to have Rob Dongoski from EY join us. He runs their ag and food division at EY. He and I have, in full disclosure, have known each other for quite some time. So I'm looking forward to the opportunity to get a chance to visit with him here on the second installment of our Dialed In podcast. Rob, you were supposed to be first, but we couldn't get on your calendar in time, so you ended up sliding into the second slot. Nonetheless, really excited to have you here with us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's always fun connecting.
That's great. Rob, what we want to do first is maybe give our audience a chance. You know, I talk about EY quite a bit. We have a great partnership. We work together on a number of different things. But when I mention EY, people are like, "Well, who is EY, and what do they do in food and agriculture?" So maybe you could take us through exactly who is EY and what do y'all do in this food and ag space.
Yeah, so EY is one of the larger professional services firms in the world. We've got about 400,000 people globally, and focused on assurance, tax, and then consulting and transactions, which is where I spend most of my time. So I'm actually part of EY Parthenon, which is our strategy firm, where we're working with any client across the entire food system on where are they going, how do they get there, what are the new markets, all kinds of things that are challenging their business or helping them reach new heights.
So, Rob, one of the things is, so it used to be, and this was a while ago, I guess now, EY was Ernst & Young. For those who don't understand EY, how do you have this company called EY with 400,000 people globally? At one time, you were known as Ernst & Young, correct? It's the same group.
Yeah, I think you can go back. We were Ernst & Ernst, Arthur Young, and then most recently Ernst & Young, and then recently we just shortened to EY. So that's our current name.
Okay, good. So, Rob, you kind of you were sort of the founder, if you will, of the food and ag side of the practice a little bit. How did you get there? Where did you sort of give us a little bit about your personal background, how you got to where you are in developing this food and ag space?
Yeah, I'm a native of Central Illinois, Decatur specifically, and so I've always been around the corn, soybeans world. It's just part of what I grew up with. But I started my career in banking, and then eventually ended up at EY. And at one point there, about in the early 2000s, we sold our consulting practice. So I spent time at Fidelity Investments as I didn't move with the transaction. But I came back to EY about 18 years ago. And when I came back, I started working with food companies right out of the gate. And what I noticed right away is that you can't really, bring all the value to a food company if you're not thinking about their sourcing and their agriculture side. So, what I was really probably the early innovator on was, linking ag and food together and treating it not as individual sectors, but really as a system, a very interconnected system that has primary actors and secondary actors. And so I've been doing that for almost 10 years now at EY. So it's been a lot of fun, to say the least.
It's interesting to me, Rob. I do credit you with that sort of thinking that way. We've done some of that here at Purdue too. Over time, really tried to think quite a bit about, ag and food as all one thing. Although, I do think that a fair amount of the industry still in reality has a lot of sort of ag stuff thrown over the wall to food, and food does their own thing. But that seems to be changing. And in fact, I think, Rob, one of the terms that you coined, perhaps I'm giving it to you and I shouldn't give it to you and you'll give credit to somebody else, but I credit you with this idea of a food system reimagined, as you call it. It's sort of to me, an underlying brand of EY Food and Agribusiness is sort of this food system reimagined. Tell me, what is food system reimagined and what do you reimagine it being?
Yeah, thanks for the credit for the term. I'm sure I've got a great team, and marketing is not my foray, so I'm sure it came out of the team somewhere. But basically, what Food System Reimagined is it's a decade forward view of how we see the food system evolving. And it's not like it's a point in time, but it's not tomorrow, it's not a year from now. But if we look at a decade, what's going to be different? And it's really there's three main pillars that we think about. Number one is an increase in consumer centricity. And people argue, well, hey, food system today is consumer centric. That's where it all ends up, right? But I think we've seen innovation happen more from a production standpoint and not with consumers in mind per se. And now consumers are really driving that narrative to say, here's what I want, here's how I want it treated, here's the kinds of ingredients I want in my food. And so I think that consumer centricity is one element that's changing things pretty dramatically. The second one is around planet friendliness. And again, I think, people really criticize, I think, the ag industry specifically for, greenhouse gas emissions and all that. And I think, at the end of the day, I mean, can we be better? Yes. Is maybe a big a black eye as it deserves in the press? I don't think so. But there's definitely an opportunity to be more planet friendly as a food system. And then the last pillar really around it is a new connectivity, and so today we basically move food from left to right in a linear format. And we think about the future being much more connected, much more ecosystem oriented, various networks inside networks, things like that we think will have tremendous impacts on the supply chain, the value chain, all the way across.
So, Rob, I think about this, these sort of concepts around consumer centric, sort of planet friendly, and connectivity, and part of me says this is just not new. I mean, I suppose that my grandparents or my great grandparents raised their own food, so they were pretty focused on themselves, and they knew not to mess things up, or they wouldn't have those crops the next year, those animals the next year, and I don't think you can be more connected than doing it yourself, probably, right? So, tell me why you think that food system needs to be reimagined. If I could imagine one 50 years ago.
Yeah, I often say the future of food is retro, and so when I look back, I think you're exactly right. When I look back and I say, you know what, there was a point in time where consumers knew their producers, right? And we go back not even that many decades ago, half a dozen, 8, whatever. And, you knew who produced your meat. That was somebody that, it came from the butcher. It came from out in the farm somewhere. You knew where it came from. You had a florist on one corner. You had a baker on the other side. No, by the way, you actually had milk delivered to your house. So home delivery is nothing new either, right? And so I think, we are talking about retro, but the connectivity that consumers had to producers in the past was around physical proximity. And now we have a global supply chain. We have at least a pan US supply chain, and when you look at that, it's like, how do consumers get to know producers again? I don't think it's as much by physical proximity as much about data and insights and transparency. So I think now we're starting to see a digital connection versus a physical connection.
Yeah, so interesting that you talk about that in terms of particularly the connectivity piece being digital. Of course, dialed in. This is what we focus on, is this whole idea of digital. So perhaps self-serving, but you had written something recently here back in late 22, I think, around sort of the idea of value networks, and you talk about this sort of physical digital disconnect that exists right now. Some of what you're talking about. Can you give me some sense of what you're thinking around that, why you see the future of sort of the food industry being this idea of around value networks? What is that, and how do you see that playing out?
Well, I think right now the strategic question for anyone in the food system, where the strategy question's always been, where do you play, how do you win, right? And I think the strategic question now starts with, what role do you play in the future food system? And is that role that you want to play different than the role you're playing today, for one? For two, is it as valued in a future food system as is in today's food system? And if those things are not right on track, then you ask the question, what should I do? And so I think you start to see opportunities to leverage your assets, leverage your capabilities into a new value formula that consumers are desiring. So if consumers are going to make choices on their food beyond just taste and affordability, which I think will always be the two criteria that is the primary choices, right? But if they start to things in the 3, 4, and 5 slots that move up to, is this planet friendly? Were the animals treated humanely? Do I know, exactly what kind of feed went into this animal? When they start to make decisions off of that, the connectivity to your suppliers, to your supplier's suppliers, starts to change. And you start to, think about, what's the value that I'm driving versus what do I need from my supplier's supplier, to really think about bringing that value forward to the consumer. Consumers are I think now more than ever is it's not a big blob of all one. We talk about segmentation, but when you think about a food system that starts to become personalized, you're creating a market of one. And so how do you start to, cater to a market of one that is in a personalized food system? Clearly it won't be a single person, but I mean, you're going to really kind of micro segment the consumer population going forward.
Yeah. So Robert, so I want to tackle this issue around that. This is really sort of that value network is driven by the whole concept of the connectivity. Although the reality is that also the planet friendly is a part of that, particularly because the argument is that the consumer wants to know, how did you treat that field, how did you treat that animal, which is the partly the planet friendly side of that need to be connected. My question is to you, will the consumer pay for that?
You know, we're going to see, I think, a couple different consumer behaviors. So one are consumers who care a lot about their food. They want to know a lot about it, and they're willing and able to pay for it. And then you're going to find consumers who aren't as interested in their food, and they see it as, merely, a matter of course, and they're unwilling or unable to pay for it. And so I think if you start to think about those two segments, it starts to really, shape the food story. But we can easily focus on consumers really, really fast. But I also think about farmers at the other end. Are farmers making decisions around transparency? How much does my seed cost? Why does seed cost go up 15% this year? It's the same seed I had last year. Tell me why that is, and are we willing to give transparency to farmers as well to make their buying decisions? And now more than ever, I think we're starting to see this digital physical asset combination, particularly in upstream farming, where it's not about the price, it's about the outcome. And so you start to think about that narrative, and I think it becomes very, very interesting when you start to merge physical and digital assets that way.
So, Rob, I'm going to take you down a path that maybe you're not prepared for, and let's just see where this goes a minute. But
You always do this, so I'm prepared for that.
So I'm thinking a little bit about this connectivity piece. Clearly, that's that sort of digital footprint, or to me at least, I think of it as that digital footprint. How we're going to share the data and the information across the system. We haven't done that in the past very well, in my judgment. In fact, I'm not too sure, and you can agree or disagree with me, that I'm still not sure we do it well inside the firm, much less trying to do it across companies in that system, right? Yet I think is the case, at least in North America. Maybe it's only in North America. By and large, the consumer trusts our food system. What created that trust? How did that trust get created if we haven't been transparent in the past?
Yeah, I mean, I think, we can give credit to a lot of different people in the value chain. I mean, I think we can look at our regulatory bodies who, people have learned to trust. Now we can say that, that's, big institution, and consumers have skepticism around big institutions. So, that can kind of be played both ways. I think there's comfort in big brands, big friendly brands that, people like and trust and have built that kind of brand loyalty, brand equity. I think that's another area that built trust. I think today's world is starting to shift a little bit. If you look at the number of farmers' pictures that show up on packages today, tells me that they're trying it. Big brands are trying to appeal to consumers in a different way. Is that the farmer that produced the product inside the bag? No, but it represents that they know where the food came from, and they've got a connection all the way back to the land. I think that's the message. And then you can look at the rise of some of the small brands, where I think the big challenge is big brands got to figure out how to appear small, and small brands got to be careful not to get too big, right? And I think particularly in the Gen Z and millennial generations, the fact that you found a cool brand, you virally spread it to friends, and everyone's trying it. I mean, that's a cool thing for a small brand. As soon as that thing gets really, really big and everyone has it, that they lose interest. And so I think there's some value in kind of having more connectivity to the brand in a couple different ways.
So I find that interesting, Robin. Actually, maybe we practiced that, but I don't think we did, because I didn't expect you to answer that way. But that is exactly what I was thinking about, particularly this idea of, well, you have government regulatory bodies. That for sure is there, and we've been pretty good at that in the U.S., frankly, over time. Europe, maybe not so much. The one reason why you have less trust there is the regulatory body struggled historically in that space. Here, maybe not as much. But brands have played such a big role over time, and it seems to me that the new smaller brands that you're talking about have a tendency to have positioned their brand more around the transparency piece and the data and the information, as opposed to the big brands. The established brands didn't do it that way because they said, one, it's hard to do. By the way, it's hard to do traceability and transparency. So they said, let us take care of it. We'll trust us. We'll do this for you, and that worked. But now the consumer's saying, well, now wait a minute, are you really doing what your brand says you were going to do? That's what I think is sort of shifting here. And I say that in a sense that, and you know this because I've told you this before, I'm not convinced that there's enough consumers in the marketplace big enough. They're going to go out and with their phones and QR codes and search down every piece of food they're buying, where it's going to go. I don't think there's enough of those, but there's enough big brands that have figured out, but if I don't have that capacity, that capability, that ability to not just say, trust my brand, but actually verify that my brand stands for what it stands for, I'm in trouble. Does that sound right?
Yeah, I think you're right on point. I mean, one thing is think about Western brands in an Eastern nation, right? And so Eastern nations, tend to trust Western brands, not because of the brand itself, but because they know the scrutiny that it goes under, right? And so there's some, there's certain Eastern countries that'll buy a Western brand before an in-country brand simply for that reason. I think the other side that's, I think, hurting big brands, particularly with, again, I think the younger generations, is the fact that, we've got a lot of, stories and, blogs and stuff that come out and talk about, all the different things that these big brands have done and so forth on the heels of already a consumer population that distrusts large institutions. And so big companies fall into that institution category. And I think they're challenged now to reconstitute their brands for something that may be different than what they were known for, a decade or so ago.
Right. So, Rob, if we think that, let me just express my bias. I think yours is similar. Our industry is really good. The ag and food industry is really a great industry. It has a great history. It has a great story to tell of innovation over time. This change in the marketplace that you feel is happening, and I do too, is afoot, is one that we struggle with a bit because it's a set of technologies that maybe our industry is not as used to or familiar with. What I like to say to people is very, very good, taking physical stuff and innovatively turning it into physical stuff that's more useful for humans. And this digital piece is not, it's not core to what we do in food and agriculture. So to be innovative there is a bit more of a challenge for us to think about because it's an enabling sort of technology rather than sort of the core of what we do, right? So I kind of think of it that way. So yet what we're talking about here is a change where likely that technology is the core of what helps you get to that. So what do you think have to be the assumptions that need to be true for our industry to really sort of adopt this digital transformation mindset? What are we going to have to make that actually happen?
Yeah, I mean, there's two misnomers I think about agriculture, right? And one is that they're not innovative, and so I know my peers in the automotive industry come over to me and talk about, 5 years they're talking about autonomous vehicles, and I said we've had autosteer in place for a dozen years, so you guys are a little late to the party, right? So innovation happens, and if you walk on any farm or you watch a farmer's machine break down in the middle of a field, you'll see a real innovation in action as they figure out how to get that thing running again, right? So I'm challenged to think that our ag industry is not innovative, but I don't think it's what has to be true. I think the question that I think everyone has to ask is, when you think about technology on farm through the system, the question is, will you disrupt the industry or will you be disrupted? And I think there's only two choices. I don't think you can go halfway on some of these technologies. I think you got to decide which ones matter and place some bets, and so I think that's going to be the big play. We can talk about blockchain traceability and you can stay out of that market or you can enter the market, do one or the other. But I think once you dabble, I think you're really, hedging bets, not placing bets.
Mm-hmm. That's an interesting way to think about that is either you got to be all in or not. Let me ask you this question about it, because I think that choice, that strategic choice, is not my sense is we can sit on the outside and say we know what the choice should be, or we think we know what the choice should be. Sitting on the inside of that, as I try to do that and think about being at the firm level, I think it's a harder choice than it might seem,
Oh yeah.
because well, look, the industry by and large, for all of its history, has mostly been built off of private information. And the more we think about adopting digital technologies, we have to think, as you do, as you suggest here, a value network. We've got a network of people working together in this process. Suddenly, information, which has been our primary currency of value for various players within the chain, is now being commoditized in that process. And I think if I'm in the industry, I got to think carefully about what does it look like for me to be in the industry? What does my business model have to look like if it's about a transparent information system, not one that is built on private information? And I think the easy answer is, well, you're going to get disrupted if you decide to stay with private, but private's worked for 1,000 years.
Yeah, private. Let's just take blockchain for an example. Private versus public blockchain. There's has been, I think, will be for a while, a raging debate around that. You got to be careful you don't get trapped into a private blockchain. All of a sudden you find yourself, you can't get out. And is a public blockchain going to be more transparent? I think those are some of the questions. My previous answer, I don't mean to say that you got to go in and digitize and bring technology to every single aspect of your business, but we've gone through period after period of technology overhype, and I think we got to be careful and selective on the technologies we go after. I think ultimately you say, how do I decide where to put my bets, which technology to put in? I think it starts with what experience are you trying to disrupt in the industry, or what experience are you trying to create with your customer, your supplier? Everybody uses Uber as a great example. I mean, you think about Uber, why did they succeed? Well, they looked at the industry and they said, taxis have dispatch that a lot of people, it's bad connection, can't hear them. They say a taxi's on the way and I have no idea when it's coming or so forth. And then ultimately, taxis say they take credit cards, but they really want cash. How many times did you get out of a taxi thinking you're paying a credit card and they go, oh, sorry, we don't take one, right? So what did Uber do? Uber said, well, let's just not even have a dispatch service. Done. We won't have to deal with that at all. We won't have one. We will only take credit cards. So I think that kind of, bold disruption, it was all about the experience first. It wasn't that the technology that was selected, but it was the experience they wanted to create it. And that's what really, I think, disrupted that industry. And I think we have the same opportunity with consumers in food and farmers all the way upstream in the fields.
That's really insightful, Rob. And it's one of the things that I'm glad to hear you say. It's what we focus on in Dow Ventures, right? The technology is not what drives Dow Ventures. It's what problem we need to solve. What's the challenge that we need to solve? And I was just interviewing a potential fellow for our next cycle. And he asked me, he said, well, Allan, how do you feel about AI or ML and I told him, I'll tell you exactly what I told him. I said, well, in general, we're technology agnostic, but we want to go and solve a problem. And frankly, a fair amount of the challenges we've got in food and agriculture could probably be solved with the tech stacks that already exist today. You don't have to get all that fancy to start trying to actually solve a problem that exists out there. But if AI or ML are the right solution for the problem we're trying to solve, or a blockchain is the right way to put together the system, we're all about those technologies being a part of it. And of course, in the end, you don't want to ignore the fact that VCs will fund you if you use the letters A and I. So obviously, if we can figure out how to do that.
Or ES and G.
Or ES and G, any one of those three, right? So you want to be careful about that part of it. But the point that I think that I hear you saying, and I agree with it, is this whole idea that let's figure our decision is around what problem are we trying to solve, which is ultimately what are we going to disrupt in the industry? Because the solving is saying, well, it's being done this way. We think it should be done that way. And then figure out what the technology is that should help you enable getting that done.
Yeah, it's about discernment, right? I mean, it's about determining what really is going to make an impact. But, if you're running around with ChatGPT trying to figure out how to solve agriculture problems, you're a hammer looking for a nail, right? If you're sitting there upstream going, farmers they're struggling with what to plant next year on whether it's rotations or they're thinking about regen ag, they're thinking about this, thinking about that, that's a problem. Now, if you solve that with ChatGPT or you solve it with some really smart agronomist in a pad of paper, who cares? You're solving the problem. Now, you may start with a manual, maybe not technology efficient, solution, to begin with. Then the question gets down to, can you scale, and now maybe you need to think about heavier technology, a little bit more bold investment that when you really start to, go down the path of scale.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And in our system, it's got to ultimately be driven by scale. It's one of the reasons why I remind people over and over: can we be better in our industry? The answer is yes. Should we be better in our industry? The answer to that is clearly yes. We should always be striving to be better at those things. But we also have to remember that the scale at which we are able to do things in agriculture is pretty shocking already, of what we can do and how that has led to the ability to feed a growing population better and better over time, right? So we're pretty good
Right.
at
But I
what we
think
do.
it's
And scale has always been a part of how we did that.
absolutely. And I think it's interesting. Someone asked me the other day, what do I think is the most disruptive technology in the last 30 years? I said Excel, because I think there's still a lot of business problems that are modeled and solved using Excel with data that may be collected in SAP, Oracle, and all those other systems. But I mean, Excel has been a phenomenal piece of technology. It's just at some point when you're like, you know what, I got to scale this out to 10,000 people. It doesn't scale, so now you got to get into something different. But, I think that's it's a game-changing technology.
Rob Dongoski, thank you for telling me that, because you and I, 14 years ago, I think now, decided we'd dig into spreadsheets in the deepest way we could think of doing it in a class that we were in together, if I recall correctly.
I think that's about right. And I go way back. So I even go back to like Lotus 1, 2, 3, right? So I remember writing macros back in the day. So,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
Well, Rob, one last question for you as we get ready to go here. So I'm curious about Rob Dongoski's future in food. So I know we've got a farm in Kentucky. We grew up in the farming country, maybe even farming. So tell me a little bit about these three pillars of the reimagined food system, and is Rob Dongoski reimagining his own food system?
Well, first off, let me clarify. Farm in Tennessee, which
Tennessee, not Kentucky.
Tennessee.
Sorry, I didn't get far enough south. That's
Yeah,
right.
I've got a good friend in Kentucky who would have just laughed at that comment, and he'll probably see this and give me a call, so I got to clarify that one. But, I do have a small farm, and I mean, I'm always, obviously working pretty hard at EY these days, but, I do think about my farm and I think about what can I do with it, and I think about, things, across the board. Do I want to be in animal production or plants? Do I want to, try to source food locally to restaurants? Do I want to put up a big greenhouse and produce something at a little bit bigger scale? So I'll be doing something for sure. For me, it's time and capital, like a lot of entrepreneurs, so we'll see. I'll say, stay tuned and, bring me back on dialed in another year. Maybe I'll have a better answer for you.
That sounds good, Rob. Rob Dongoski, EY Parthenon's head for food and agribusiness. Rob, thank you so much for taking the time, providing some great insights to us here. Wish you the best of luck.
All right. Thanks, Allan. I appreciate it. And good luck on the Dial program. It's a wonderful program.
Thank you.